Welcome. My name's Dr. Dickon Bevington. I'm what they call a child and adolescent psychiatrist. That means I'm a medical doctor who works with, young people who have worries of one sort or another, and I specialise in working with young people who have developed significant problems with substances of one sort or another, from alcohol right up to serious drugs like heroin. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about cannabis and young people. And in the room with me is Liz Cracknell, who's over there, and she's going to wave at me if I'm going on too long. We're going to try and keep this talk to just 10 minutes. And we work with a team called CASUS, which works with young people in Cambridgeshire, which we'll give you contact details for at the end of this film. So, cannabis. Who's using it and how are they using it? Well, the good news is that actually, if you look across the world, less people overall are using cannabis slightly than was the case maybe a few years ago. On the other hand, those people who are using it, it seems as though they're actually using more than was the case in the past. And another big difference, which is particularly of concern to us, is that the cannabis that's available is actually significantly stronger than it used to be, even maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And finally, this is particularly of interest to Liz and myself and other members of the team, young people who do start using cannabis are tending to start to use it actually quite a lot earlier in their lives than has ever been the case before. So it's not all good news at all. Well, what does this mean? Well, we know that things are different from how they were in the past, that young people are getting cannabis younger and they're using stronger cannabis. But we don't actually know what the effect of this will be. What we know from the science is there's lots of good reasons to be worried about that, but it's as though all the young people really across the world are part of a massive experiment to see what happens if we bathe young developing brains in powerful substances from an early age. And I think we have to ask ourselves as a society, but you as young people, are we happy about that? Okay. Well, what does the science tell us? I'm going to try to keep this as tight as I can. We know without a shadow of a doubt that the younger people start to use substances of any kind, alcohol, cigarettes, or cannabis, or stronger drugs, the worse their outcomes over the length of their life tends to be, in terms of their risk of becoming addicted, in terms of their educational success, their ability to get jobs, their ability to hold down stable, happy relationships, and their ability to stay healthy in terms of their mental health. So that's a fairly kind of comprehensively well-documented, scientifically known fact. The other thing that we know is that the cannabis that's actually available, if you're buying cannabis these days, is different from the cannabis that was available even 10 or 15 years ago. And it's different in two really key ways. One is the amount of this magnificently named chemical tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's the part of cannabis which, if you like, is the most hallucinogenic. It develops the most powerful effects on the brain and the mind, and brings about effects that have some things in common with some of these very serious illnesses, such as psychoses that I'm going to mention later. We know there's more of that, and we know there's less of the more sedative and calming ingredient, which is called cannabidiol. So where in the past you had kind of a balance between the rather sort of powerful effects of tetrahydrocannabinol and the calming effect of the cannabidiol, what's happening now is you've got extremely high levels of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and relatively almost no cannabidiol. So these are quite concerning, and there's been some very interesting science to suggest that, strangely enough, if you actually give people a blind test of different proportions of these things, you give them the very high THC and the very low cannabidiol, and you give them a kind of more balanced mixture like the old-fashioned cannabis, The balanced mixture is what people report actually having more pleasure from than what you can get on the market now, which is this really high THC and almost no cannabidiol, which actually people find, if they don't know what they're taking, often quite disturbing, distressing and frightening. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, there's a risk actually just of any old fart like me coming up and talking about this stuff, because I think it sort of can easily trigger in a young person a kind of reaction of, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? You know, what on earth would he know about it? I guess we would want any young person who's watching this to be aware of the fact that we're aware of that risk, but I hope you would understand that we still feel it's really important that we talk about the risks that we see as a treatment team and transmit them to you, hopefully in a way that kind of makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk about some of these risks. I mentioned this word psychosis. This is a family of illnesses. Most people will have heard of a very serious illness called schizophrenia. That's the most well known of the psychoses, but there are many other versions that are similar. These are very serious illnesses where people to some extent lose touch with what's real and what's not. They may hear or see things that other people can see are not there. They may believe things very powerfully when everybody else can see that they're not true. And one of the common effects of cannabis reported by many users is this feeling of paranoia. And that's, if you like, on the verge of some of these more obviously illness-related experiences. So psychosis is something that people have a risk of just being vulnerable to. And about 1 to 2 in every 100 people is vulnerable to developing a psychosis. And to some extent that's the luck of the draw. It's the way the genes that you get when you're born come together in your particular person. So if you think of a standard classroom in the UK of about 30 kids, well, in every 3 classes there may be 1 or 2 young people who are at significant risk of developing a psychosis. And we know absolutely emphatically that using cannabis, and particularly using cannabis at a young age, does increase that risk quite significantly of triggering that illness. That's quite a rare problem, but there are many others that we meet. Young people who are using a lot of cannabis may feel depressed or lack some motivation. They're missing a lot of learning for later life. It's very difficult to get the kind of education that you need if you're stoned compared to the guys sitting next to you. And there's a lot of social learning, just learning to have relationships. We're also interested in the fact that cannabis does seem to have some addictive properties. Previously we didn't think that was the case. But there's certainly quite a lot of interest in the dependency that people can get with this. Money problems are pretty well known to any young person who's smoking cannabis. It's expensive, and they often, in trying to raise money for it, will get into relationship problems when they're asking for money from parents or friends, which may run into problems later on. And dealers are often very happy to give free or cheap samples to start with, but then will become much less forgiving when they want their money back. And crime is quite a big problem. When money's very short, a lot of young people would say, I'd never have gone into that, but they do end up in some kind of criminal activity to make money for the drugs that they're using. And of course, lastly but not leastly, cannabis itself, we need to remember, is what we call a Class B drug, which means that it carries quite significant penalties in terms of being caught in possession, and very significant penalties if you're caught supplying, and that even means supplying to your friends. It's not, that is still seen in the eyes of the law as dealing. So there are problems with cannabis that we would want young people to be very aware of and to be balancing. So thank you very much for listening to that talk, and we'll show details of the team in Cambridgeshire for young people under the age of 18 living in this county. You could contact us. Other young people who are watching this, there will be services in your local area that you, I'm sure, can contact either through your GP or through your school will probably know where to go as well. Thank you very much for listening.